Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including one talking about what a war with China would actually look like. How long would it take us to rearm, to rebuild, to be ready? And our second article talking about another war, though one that's a little bit more theoretical, which is the war that is coming within the FBI. So we're going to be talking about Kash Patel's plans, as he is probably going to be the director of the FBI underneath Donald Trump. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, how long do you think it would take us to be ready for a war with China? We'll go through some of the fascinating details about how long it actually would take, but I want to know what your opinion is off the top of your head. Throw it down there, and if you're wrong, it is what it is. I was woefully wrong when I first was thinking about it, so I'll admit that, and I hope it's a pass for anybody who is kind of hesitant to just put it down there and possibly be a little bit further off than some people would expect. But I want to know what everybody's first impression or first answer to that question would be, is the better way to put it. So with that said, we're going to go to our first article that comes from the Washington Free Beacon. Headline reads, "In a war against China, the U.S. runs out of missiles in a matter of weeks, House committee finds." So, as anybody who has been listening to my channel for quite some time knows, China is a threat that I am relatively hawkish on. And I will say it every single time, because anybody who is new and is coming to this will probably not understand my perspective right off the bat. So I want to make sure that anybody new that comes to this understands where I'm coming from, and maybe I can explain why they're a geopolitical threat to us when it comes to resources. They're an economic threat when it comes to their manufacturing, and they're becoming a military threat and a naval threat when it comes to trade routes. So all of these things, and we can go into more detail. You can go listen to my previous episodes where I really dive into it. But all of those preliminary things are really important to set the stage for this conversation, because this conversation is going to be based on the assumption that either a war with China and the U.S. is coming, or it is inevitable, so to speak. And we have to really game out what is going to happen. So the House committee one of these House committees is actually sitting down and saying, oh, well, what would happen if we were to go to war over Taiwan, if we were to defend our ally there in the region, one of the only major democracies besides South Korea and Japan, right there in the what the Chinese would call the South China Sea, where they have their 7-dot line. They're slowly trying to encroach upon it. You could also say the Philippines are, but they're not necessarily a strong democracy like a place like Taiwan is. And Japan is a pretty strong democracy, don't get me wrong, but there is also, at least to some degree, an idea that there is corruption within the culture, especially more recently. Then again, this can be dismissed as small-time stuff compared to the corruption that you see in China, in different nations, right on the edge of Europe, or in certain other Asian nations. I'm not trying to say it's anywhere to that level, but with some of the more recent crises between the previous prime minister and his party, there is this idea that there's a little bit more corruption going on there. Taiwan, while not unblemished, is most definitely a democracy that we have put a lot of weight behind, and they have economic incentives that they are lording in front of us, which are the fabs that create these semiconductors, which are so essential to the next generation of technology and probably the next cycle of the free market economy and technology in the world. So there's no doubt that there's plenty of incentive to go there. Now, whether we go over there and we have boots on the ground war versus China on the island of Taiwan, or invading into China, I don't know. And I'm not going to pretend to know. There have definitely been game plans made, but all of that is predicated on the fact that we are actually capable of doing it. And that is what is scary when it comes to this report that's coming out of this House committee. I'm going to read the first paragraph for you to set the scene. Quote, "In a war with China, the United States would expend its stock of advanced missiles and bombs in less than a month and run out of some critical weapons in a matter of days, according to a war game simulation conducted by the House Select Committee on China. America's cache of long-range anti-ship missiles, critical to defending Taiwan in a sea battle in the case of a Chinese invasion, will run dry within 3 to 7 days, according to the committee's findings." End quote. That is absolutely stunning. Now, you may be asking, where are these missiles going? Well, we're sending over some of our stockpiles to Ukraine. We're actually sending some to Israel, but not as much. That's more military aid, or that's aid that can actually be spent threefold. So for every dollar we give them, they can actually purchase about $3 worth of products here in the United States. So those military contractors are absolutely loving that. No doubt about it. Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed are sitting back, oh, okay, yeah. Throw a nice little stimulus Israel's way and make sure that when it comes back to us, it's actually worth a little bit more. So the point that I'm getting at with that statement is our resources have been deployed to other places. Now, you could say those places that we're deploying them are righteous wars to be defending or to be supporting. You could say that's completely justifiable. We're not going to go into those sort of questions today, because the practical question that you have to ask is, are we able to defend ourselves with what we have? And when we're sending all of these advanced missiles, advanced pieces of technology to other places, and we don't necessarily have the infrastructure to make it quick enough, that's the other important part. Because the first part is how big is our stockpile. The second part is how quickly can we replenish said stockpile. Well, it's not as fast as you would think. Now, I'm going to actually spend a little bit more time on the timeline as we go further into this, but I want to read one other quote before we get into that. The simulation was run more than 25 times to ensure the accuracy of the results, which repeatedly showed the U.S. had insufficient stockpiles of critical munitions for a protracted war. This includes the missiles that would be key to defeating China in any land and sea battle, end quote. Now, one thing we have to consider is they have a larger industrial base than we do. They have a large segment of their economy still in manufacturing. So even if they don't necessarily have the manufacturing or the industry to make all these various weapons right on demand, that doesn't mean that these industrial centers all across China can't be retooled and actually made to focus on more war-oriented weapons. The other major thing that will be a concern is, can we even get our aircraft carriers, our battle cruisers, our various types of ships into the South China Sea, into the Taiwan Strait, or at least around Taiwan? Can we even resupply the nation when there are land-based missiles, whether it be intercontinental or even just short-range missiles, that they can fire from mainland China and actually intercept us in the water? That is what we are facing when we go that close to China, especially on a naval front, because we're going to have to. At the end of the day, we are so far away, there is no land front where we can cause any sort of pressure, and the only way to get to supplies to them is going to be through the Navy. So there's probably going to be a blockade. That's why having as many missiles and long-range missiles that can be deployed, so basically long-range heavy munition missiles that are actually deployable, so they're small enough that they're deployable from various types of ships, are going to be extremely important, because we're, one, going to have to actually strike some of these onshore bases where they're housing the missiles, where they're firing the missiles from, but also we're going to need a systems possible. And let's be clear, my expertise as to what we have on naval ships nowadays that would be akin, and I say akin, not exactly, a mini Iron Dome. We would have to fit almost all of our ships with this, and we would have to be constantly resupplying with them. That is a highly intensive war right there, let alone the fact that it could be protracted because, like I said, mainland China is right there. They can continue to refuel and to restructure where they're firing these sort of things from, and they've been building up their Navy. Now, is their Navy to the same echelon? Is it in the same echelon as the American Navy? No, but they do have a raw total of more boats, period, full stop. Now, are some of those fishing boats, some of them retrofitted fishing boats that are being counted to bolster their numbers? Sure, but there is an argument, there is something to the argument that quantity has a really big effect, even if you have the largest or the best quality products. So you can even make an argument about the economic side of things, which is we have quality products here in the United States, but China just floods the market with a whole bunch of cheap products. And though altogether they're not any better, at some point, people are going to actually choose the cheaper thing, or at least a large segment of the population is going to choose a cheaper thing. There are situations where quantity alone is able to actually outstrip the quality. And I think a great example would be if China decided to start using more guerrilla tactics and put bombs on some of these fishing vessels and just send them straight in to some of our main fleet. Now, does that mean that it's actually going to work? Are they going to succeed 100% of the time? No, but if you have hundreds upon thousands, maybe, of small fishing boats or boats that have been retrofitted to be in military service that are small enough that you can get them in maybe undetected or maybe send in multiple at a time, a low resource sort of attack, then it could be very deadly. So my point overall is that this is a situation we cannot simply ignore. When we cannot continue to throw resources into other places if we want to seriously consider defending Taiwan going into the future. So let's actually talk about some other quick facts that are very interesting here. Quote, it would take the United States decades longer to rebuild ships and aircraft carriers destroyed in a standoff with Beijing. America's aircraft carrier replacements would take an estimated 40 years to resupply, while new attack submarines would take right around 8 years, according to a summary of the war games published by the China Committee. Now, obviously, we've still built out a lot of our nuclear submarines. We've been growing our fleet of submarines, but 8 years is still a long turnaround time. A war can be over and done with way before that. So to pretend that we are in a prime position in order to really tool up for war, no, we're not even there. 40 years to resupply an aircraft carrier. Now, are our aircraft carriers superior to theirs? Definitely. We can launch more planes off of them. We have less restrictions when it comes to the planes that we can actually get off them. I mean, a lot of their aircraft carriers are secondhand purchases. They have ramps in order to help their planes. We have planes, in theory, that can actually go up from a absolute stop state, and they don't actually have to be propelled forward. So, and they can land without having to be caught by a wire system that has to be reset so we can get our boys out of the air relatively quickly. But my point being that 40 years is still a tight turnaround for anything, but even for something that we were notorious, and you could say notorious from the eyes of the Japanese, from the eyes of our energy, but famous for, in the eyes of our allies, for building back in the day. Now, we need to take one more step back, and now we're going to ask the larger question. Is this inevitable? Are we going to end up in a place where we are going to head with Beijing? I think that it is not inevitable. I think it is 60-40% likelihood at this point, though I think that percentage goes up the weaker we appear on the world stage, but two, the weaker that China gets. It will be a tiger trying to lash out, who is, hurt on the underbelly, trying to lash out, show that it is strong, and solidify what is now an even more rebellious administration in Taiwan. If the politicians in Taiwan, right now the prime minister is very, very vocal about talking out against China. And if they have someone who is even more vocal, who's even more passionate about saying that they are not a part of China, that they are the independent democracy in the region that will stand up to China, that will not let China bully them around, China cannot stand for that, especially if the U.S. is giving them their backing. But the underlying current to all of that is, can the U.S. back them up? If this war is inevitable, or at least likely, are we in a position to actually win? You should never court war, but you should always prepare for it. And that's a version of many, many other famous quotes, but it is very, very true, because you never know, especially with a state as volatile as China, where 1 minute they could be singing your praises because you kowtow to them, and then they could be absolutely screaming at you because you kowtow to them. They could be absolutely mean and vicious and trying to undermine all of your efforts, whether they be economic or whether they be military or influence or intelligence within the region, or they can be trying to spin it so that it's their own good. They are a state which truly acts at the whims of a elite and small few, mainly Xi Jinping, ever since he's been able to remove the term limits for president. He is basically president for life. He is dictator for life as long as he can consolidate power behind the scenes in the CCP and get rid of his political enemies, as he is so well known for doing, even in a kind way, in at least in Chinese communist terms. Kind is allowing you to go on TV and shuttling you off during the middle of his acceptance speech in order to, show you as a part of the process, but not necessarily give you credit, to not allow your faction to feel as though they're gaining any sort of power. Of course, there are always internal political games, and if China internally fails, then we won't see a war, but I don't know if they are that close to destabilization. I want to believe, when you see the stories coming out of China of these massive protests or just demonstrations of students getting on bikes and traveling to other cities and then having these shut down, the banning of certain Halloween costumes in China, the restrictions on social media, which have been there forever, whether or not those actually bubble up into anything, there has to be a concerted movement across, one, it's a massive nation, but two, remember, they have a population of over 1 billion. 100,000 people being discontent, even 1 million people being discontent, is nothing in the grand scheme of things. That's 1% of the population. It has to be a mass movement. So just because you see all of these sort of protest demonstrations, that doesn't necessarily mean that upheaval is coming. I think Xi is probably going to be locked in for the next 4 years as he comes up towards the next re-election. They may reevaluate, but I think he'll be able to keep power, though I think he will have to make a really strong showing on the world stage, which will probably be something either against the United States or Taiwan. But that's enough on that. I don't think we're prepared. I think we have to seriously think about being prepared in order to potentially go to war with China. Now, I do want to address the other thing, which is I was joking earlier that the military companies are loving the Israel-Ukraine wars, and then I'm over here saying, oh yeah, we should, scale up, be able to build these sort of things, which will probably fall onto military contractors, which means they will also make money from that. But I think my justification at the beginning, which is they pose a military threat, an intelligence threat, a geopolitical threat, and an economic threat. All of those 4 things, technically 3 categories because one's an extension of the other. But the point being that those 3 categories, when in tandem, provide a pretty easy checklist for who we should be worried about on the world stage and who we should be willing to actually go to war with. I don't think Russia actually poses that. I think Russia is possibly a geopolitical threat. I don't necessarily think that they are an economic threat, and I think their nuclear arsenal possibly puts them into the military threat, but not necessarily their soldiers on the ground. Then again, they are much more willing to lose soldiers on the ground, but I don't think they're an economic threat. I think that Hamas and Hezbollah, they are a military threat to some degree, more geopolitical, but even then, I would say it's actually a social threat to cultural norms and the perception of the West. I think that's actually the biggest threat that they pose. Iran is most definitely a military threat, especially with how they've been ramping up production on certain sort of more guerrilla warfare technology and been sending them to Russia. An economic threat, I don't think so. China is all 3 of those things, and it provides an image of what it is like to stand up against the United States, which is fair enough. If you're a nation and you want to stand up against the United States, you see us as a bully, you just make sure that you win. Otherwise, it's not going to go well for you. So that's why something is riding on the line for them as well. I think they pose the largest threat, and if we're going to want to stay a hegemon, a powerful nation, to be able to throw our cultural weight around the world, which I feel like we're fading anyway, and partially because of China, but partially because of other internal issues that we have not necessarily addressed. But if you want to continue to throw your weight around on the world stage, you have to be willing to take on these bullies as they come up, who believe they are all the hot stuff. They believe that they are the top tier, that they can take you down. And maybe they can. You can't take them lightly. That's why we have to seriously build up our manufacturing base for a lot of these different wartime weapons, materials, so on and so forth. But also, you don't necessarily have to pretend as though the world is ending and they are the greatest threat to American democracy. No, they are a threat to our image, which is even more important, in my opinion. Are they a threat to democracy itself, or do we have to lock down everything in order to beat China? We have to sacrifice everything in order to beat them? Not necessarily. But in order to stay on top and to be in a premier position to take advantage of the changing world and the changing economic sphere, yeah, we do need to be on top. Not necessarily a hegemon, but we at least need to be there in that conversation. And I think that the way that China goes about it in an aggressive, hawkish way is not the way that you want to go. The United States was willing to welcome them into the world stage. Now, if we're willing to welcome in other people who have similar values, not necessarily the exact same values, but similar values, India is a great example, and we're able to ally with them and we're able to build connections with them and grow together. And I can see a bipolar world where India and the United States are both flexing their muscles, but not necessarily in a terrible way. It's actually in a way that is spreading prosperity, versus the United States and China flexing their muscles and seeing the world as a zero-sum game. That isn't how it has to be, but we have to make sure that both actors act that way, otherwise it will go downhill. And I say both actors act that way. We have to pray that both actors act that way, and we have to try to create a system that allows that. So, that was a lot of geopolitical talk. I'm so sorry. Let's jump into our second article. It's more of the metaphorical, theoretical war. This article comes from Slate, and the title goes, "We've seen Kash Patel's enemies list," and it is terrifying, but it's actually a contraction. It's terrifying. Now, I think that I want to actually pick up from one of the last few lines here, because I think it's actually more important than a lot of what the author was saying throughout the course of the article, because I feel like it's fear-mongering. I feel like Kash Patel is going to do a lot of things that people are not going to like, but also I think in general, people don't necessarily have a whole bunch of trust in the FBI. But more importantly, I think a lot of people just have a general lack of trust in the government. Now, maybe I am generalizing, but I've talked to a lot of people, and they don't necessarily trust the government because they don't trust the government. They do not trust the government. Excuse me. That makes no sense. Basically, they don't trust the government because they feel like it's people who are out of touch, that they don't understand them, they don't know them, so on and so forth. They're so abstract and far away. And the more you know people that work in government, the more you actually are to trust it. It's a very interesting phenomenon when you look at statistics, especially in agencies like the FBI, DEA, all these different basically policing agencies. But the idea is that in order to gain the people's trust, you have to not be seen as weaponizing your power, and you have to be dispersed. If everything just happens in Washington, D.C., then for a lot of people, unless you're living in Northern Virginia like me, or you're living in D.C., Maryland, you're probably not going to feel like you're at the center of power. Now, some of the largest FBI field offices are, New York, San Francisco, so I'm not trying to say that there aren't locus of powers there. But the point being, they can feel very detached. So some of Kash Patel's ideas of actually shutting down the Hoover building and moving these agents out to different field offices, while it is definitely going to be taxing, it's going to be annoying, I think it actually could do wonders for the reputation of some of the agencies that would have this happen, but especially the FBI. No longer are they seen as a figurehead from Washington, D.C., just implementing the government's will, but rather they could be seen as more regional offices that are genuinely looking out for the interests of the people there. That's not to say they don't now, but when you have a centralized power structure, that's how it can feel sometimes. They feel ever so distant. But the one thing this author goes into here is actually why the people of the FBI may not be willing to take blanket pardons in the future for some of their actions, and to discuss more broadly the idea of Joe Biden actually giving a blanket pardon. I think it's a fascinating way to go about it. So let me read the first part of it, and then I'll read a little chunk from the last part, and then we'll go into some of the other ideas that Kash Patel has. Quote, "We're hearing more and more that Joe Biden should do some kind of massive blanket pardon for absolutely everybody, including all of Jack Smith's team, including the Mueller team, to protect everyone. Do you have any thoughts on that?" quote, "I don't think I have a position yet, but I do have thoughts. I see the obvious attraction of the idea, but I have questions like where does it end?" Quote, "Then there's also the notion that accepting a pardon implies that you are acknowledging that you did something wrong and that you were guilty. I think that we will see some people who will not accept pardons, even if they're offered, and are willing to sort of face the dragons rather than say that what they did was wrong when they believe what they did was right." End quote. And you may be saying, Alex, why is that important? What's going on here? And I think that's important because the author touches on the fact that a lot of people that operate within the FBI truly believe that they have a good sense of right and wrong, and they truly believe that they are actively fighting on the side of good, that they are pursuing a moral and just and ethical ends. And I'm not saying that they're not. I'm not saying that they are either. I think that that is really up to interpretation of each and every case. But I think in general, the general staff would actually believe that. And that quote speaks to the fact that some of these people don't even want to believe or would even say that their actions are wrong if that is implied by taking a pardon. And that honestly is the sort of ethic that we want to remain at the FBI. We want those people who stand on the principle. We want the people who are not going to be able to be bribed or who are not going to be able to be compromised. We want the best among us in the FBI. I don't feel like we have that with maybe 10% of it. And it's probably the ones that make it to the top because they play the political game, but that is pure speculation. But my point being that there is something beautiful about an agency that is truly, its one purpose is to defend from any sort of domestic threat that is built up within the nation and to protect the citizens. That is a noble goal. But the people have to believe in that goal. And as they go up to the top of the ranks, they have to continue to believe in that goal. Now, will Kash Patel's reforms and changes actually make a difference and bring that ethic back? I don't necessarily know. I don't know if I have 100% faith in all of his ideas and all of his talking points, because I feel as though he is a man who is willing to hold them accountable when they are wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean like I feel like he won't do the exact same thing and use them to his advantage and not necessarily stick to the principles he's trying to hold other people to. Then again, I don't know Kash Patel personally. I've heard stories. I've heard stories of his time while he was helping in the House. I understand that this man is not necessarily sitting back and letting the world pass him by and just simply going with the flow. He does have principles, but even the way that he approaches some of the situations in people criticizing him, or, like Sarah Isker. He said Sarah Isker, and this is one of the one people that I knew was on a list. Sarah Isker needed to at least be investigated or made sure that she doesn't get back into the DOJ underneath the next Trump term, which I don't think is going to happen anyway. Sarah Isker, if you don't know who she is a completely rational, conservative talking head who actually brings up great points all the time that are antithetical to the new MAGA conservatism, and especially about the holes in the new liberal and previous liberal doctrine. So I feel as though, and let's be clear, I've been listening to Sarah Isker for multiple years now, so maybe that's why I'm biased, but I also feel like she gives fair takes and she is not anybody's crony. And when Kash Patel is basically saying anybody that betrayed Trump during his last term needs to be out, I understand where he's coming from. It's the purity of mission. It's the purity of following your leader. But also the presidency, the Donald Trump making it to the presidency does not mean he's above the laws. It does not make him any more special. And what I mean by that is obviously he gains powers. He won electorally. He obviously has some sort of ability to do really good public speaking, so on and so forth. I'm not trying to say that, he's not special in some way. Of course, anybody that makes it to the presidency is special in some way. But when it comes to when it comes to using the powers of the government, just being the president doesn't mean you can break all of the norms and the constitutional rules, as well as the laws that are put in place and the agencies and checks and balances that are put in place by Congress and the Supreme Court. And I'm not saying that Kash Patel would be willing to do that, but someone who follows his leader as blindly as him could be one to follow that principle rather than the principle of upholding the laws. And also, I feel as though he is a man who can only see over the next threat hurdle rather than having a vision for what a beautiful functioning FBI looks like 100 years down the road. He sees over the next 10 years and getting the corruption that's affected his side out. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will be pure and operating at the most, it wouldn't be burning like the purest fuel ever. That's probably the best way to put it. So we'll see. We'll see. I think you should go read both of these articles. This one more particularly if you want more about the Kash Patel and the FBI, the way that he would run the FBI as director of the FBI. But with that, let's actually jump into our daily delight because this is an absolutely cute one. It's a story about a brave cat who is actually fighting, and I say fighting, he's kind of trying to intimidate a black bear. He's behind a glass door, and it's a funny video. If you want to go see that, if you want to have a little smile on your face after hearing all these serious topics, go read that one. All the links will be in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. A lot of them have been reposts more recently. And if you wanted to listen to an original show, 6 and 6, which is 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less, it's international news, that comes out over here at the YouTube channel and on the RSS feed on Tuesday and Thursday at the same time. So, with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.